Thank you very much. It was a very interesting presentation, and thank you for keeping time. Now I will open the floor for questions to Professor Vitali. 10 minutes question and answer, and then I will give 10 minutes each to the two other panelists. So anyone, any questions, reactions, comments? It was a perfect presentation?
Hardly.
Well, then let's give the floor to our panelists, and then I'm sure that meanwhile there could be more other questions. So I'll give the floor to Thomas Bruce, the director of the Legal Information Institute at the School of Law at Cornell University.
I'd like to thank Gerardo for the opportunity to be the rapporteur today. I'm afraid that I'm going to be a disappointing rapporteur because I've never actually been quite sure what it is that a rapporteur is supposed to do. I do have a suspicion that a good one would be able to kind of deftly synthesize our 3 days together into some kind of seamless intellectual construct that would provide penetrating and even brilliant insight and illumination to the conference theme. And actually do that without clumsily interjecting any of his own opinions or representing them as the shared opinion of the majority. So you're out of luck. This will at best be a disconnected collection of half-thought-out ideas and bad jokes. However, this has been a very striking experience for me. I've seen a lot of impressive presentations over the last few days. Despite the highly technical titles on the sessions that took place in this room yesterday, most were actually demonstrations of work that has already been undertaken and has already been successful. And there's a difficulty with those kinds of demonstrations because they give out information in the same way that one does on the first date with an attractive and desirable potential partner. The information tends to range from the neutral to the flattering and shows few, if any, of the charming little flaws that we hope the desirable partner will come to know and love as the relationship ripens. For all of that, there has been a lot of candor here, and I look forward to more as our mutual relationship ripens. This is our first time together as a group. I certainly hope it won't be the last. And for that reason, I would like to dig out some things that have been touched on but not fully explored in the hope that we can get back to them later. Having more questions than answers may be the mark of a bad rapporteur, or it may not. First of all, I think we probably need to spend no more time deciding that XML is good. Second, I hope that we all know, as our British and Italian colleagues seem to, that all of this is leading us inevitably toward an open semantic web of linked data, even though we all have some distance to go. On that point, something I was talking about a bit in the last session, I've heard many compelling arguments over the last couple of days for open common standards. Those arguments have mostly been based on cost and on the economies of scale that exist around mutual support. But we still need to figure out where the actual applications can be found, and I think that in time we will. Bob Reeves was essentially asking that question in the last session. So we need to think about what could we do that would involve the actual exchange or interoperation of legislative information among various parliaments. We have a few clues. At my shop, we get about 2,700,000 visits to our site each month. About 10% of those come from outside the United States. They come to us in order of trade volume, typically. And the question we keep asking ourselves is, well, what are these people after, and how can we make it easier for them to find? And in my mind, that has had to do with cross-jurisdictional retrieval systems, for example, that would show you the relevant U.S. statute that is comparable with one that you already know. Or it might have to do with integration with outside pools of information that really have nothing directly to do with legislation at all. I mentioned a few minutes ago the idea of looking at regulations classified by product code. You could, to some extent, do the same thing with statutes. We will be applying Eurovoc classification to the U.S. code sometime within the next year. It's on our list of things to do. So, a couple of other thoughts. On the first day, I proposed a way of categorizing our efforts. I said it rather badly at the time. 2 days later, I still find it useful. I think it may offer a key to taking a somewhat measured approach to some of our common challenges. It seems to me that we're looking at 4 types of systems in rough order of internal popularity. Systems that support work and decision-making by parliamentarians and their staff. Systems that publish and promulgate the work of the legislature to the public, systems that promote interactive public engagement, and finally, systems that create public accountability for public officials. Now, that's a classification that contains a lot of overlaps intellectually. It contains overlaps in implementation, certainly, and the pools of data that it works with overlap a lot. Why should we think about them at all? Well, they seem to me to be very useful for thinking about the sometimes tense dynamics involved in allocating resources or undertaking initiatives. For example, concentrating only on apps that serve members tends to de-emphasize shared infrastructure. It makes things very, very specific to one project. There's not a lot of common, there are not a lot of common platforms or underpinnings built. I think the 4 types of systems participate differently in efforts at efficiency or at cost reduction. I mean, for example, if you want to make the distinction among them, it might actually cause you to ask, well, when we talk about efficiency, what are we being efficient about? Efficiency at what exactly? Or even cause you to question whether efficiency is really the ultimate purpose. Don't get me wrong, it's clear we've heard many success stories here that have to do with efficiency in 2 senses. One is efficient use of resources brought about by smoothing workflows such that the costs of moving documents between stages of the legislative process are greatly reduced. The other is a kind of efficiency of work or effort that comes from giving government adequate access to its own work product, which surprisingly frequently it does not have. I also think that systems that create public exposure or accountability tend to dominate discussions about policy in a way that is probably far out of proportion to their share in day-to-day ICT management practice. It's interesting to try to imagine, for example, how a conference like this would be different if we made no mention of public accountability, if we simply banned it, or if we had no anxieties about it. And I suspect that would be true of many internal management conversations as well. The second thing I think is worth observing, and Joan Miller remarked on this a bit yesterday, the data model is changing. We all began seeing this as essentially a document management task that somehow extended from drafting through to promulgation. But now it seems that event models, Fabio was talking about this a moment ago, event models and workflow models are becoming distinct and important in their own right, and that shared quantitative data is increasingly important too. So I think it's going to be crucial in the future for us to remember that many of the documents that we have under management are really imperfect representations of events or of processes in a workflow. They're legacy encodings in that respect, and that many of the ones we have always created were created to transmit data far better offered in shared quantitative data sets. Jeff was talking a few minutes ago about differences in process. It would be good if our data models were layered in such a way as to prevent those kinds of differences from being barriers to sharing altogether, if we could essentially isolate process differences into process models. I think that in many settings, particularly data modeling, we tend to confuse the old map with the territory and look at things from a document-centric perspective when we really should be thinking more in terms of data that's been modeled with a much wider set of use cases in mind. And talking about use cases leads me very quickly to talk about the public, and that, I think, is the biggest unasked question of the last 2 days. Who's the public? Who's the public? We keep talking about the public. We don't really say much about who they are. We tend to talk about them as an undifferentiated mass. The size of that mass is clearly the cause for some anxiety. That point was made many times. How do we make that huge public response manageable? That's a question that I think needs a lot of study, particularly as to how bad the situation really is. It may be inducing a sense of panic that's a bit out of proportion to reality. I don't know. My experience is looking at what has happened with this in executive branch agencies in the United States. And there what happened was that there were widely publicized stories of proposed regulations that drew literally millions of responses from the public. As it turned out, most of them were boilerplate from members of advocacy organizations. That can now easily be filtered for unique meaning by technology. And despite the fact that a few high-profile rulemakings have drawn literally millions of comments, the median number of comments in a federal rulemaking remains well below 100. This is not the avalanche that it initially appeared to be, or that it appears to be if you pay attention only to the most sensitive aspects. It's a much more manageable problem. And I think that there's anxiety over this question that leads us away from some other things we ought to be thinking about. The first of those is that there really is no average citizen. We talk about the citizen, but citizens have very different experiences of and very different uses for government and for the legal system in general. We tend to concentrate on those citizens who are expressing strong sentiments or experiencing some kind of legal trauma, but in reality there are many who quietly make use of law in their daily professional lives. They're neither lawyers, they're not people who are suffering trauma, they're just doing their jobs. Think about hospital managers who need to look at public benefits law on a constant basis, and you get a pretty good idea of the sort of people that I'm talking about. If you think for a minute about who's impacted by the tax code or by public benefits law, or why they are, they're equally strong if smaller communities of interest around all sorts of statutes and regulations. And for the most part, those people aren't sending angry letters demanding action from members. They're just trying to find out what it is that they're supposed to be doing. Many have pointed out, and I'm concluding here, many have pointed out that service to the members has been the driver for many, many efforts. There's another driver that is so natural and so much a part of the context that we've actually overlooked it. The ultimate driver, of course, is the fact that legislatures are elected, and that members want the good things that they do to be visible to the public. The bad things maybe not so much. But there is this need for outreach. That's what led legislatures in the U.S. to be far ahead of the courts and most executive branch agencies or ministries in putting stuff online. So when we talk about how to measure transparency, I'm really tempted by a sentiment that was originally expressed by Aristotle and is since echoed by many, including Samuel Johnson and Gandhi, which is the idea that a society ought to be judged by the way that it treats those that it is not otherwise compelled to treat well. And on that view, one index of transparency is to look at what legislatures do for the public, those things that neither directly serve the members nor cause them to be reelected. That's a very pretty idea. It's not typically where a pragmatist like myself would start, but I would certainly hope that it's where all the pragmatists end up. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Despite your notion of co-rapporteur, I think you did a very good job, actually. So, Jeff Griffith, your turn.
So let me...
You failed test one, Jeff.
Yes, it's the technology. Let me share some of the things that have struck me, but let me begin by saying why the comments I'm going to share with you are important because of so many other good judgments I've made. A number of years ago, I was discussing the forthcoming Google IPO. That's where Google went public. And I was saying to my friend that I would never invest any money in Google because its search engine was fatally flawed. You see, it only impelled people to find very narrow pieces of information. It was not mind-opening. It couldn't help you find knowledge. It could just help you find the best flight back to Europe. And so I didn't invest there. I invested all my money in the U.S. auto industry. And fortunately, the president rescued us, and so my wife still speaks to me. And so that said, with you being forewarned, I offer the following observations. First, I can't help but be struck by the fact that despite our differences in our backgrounds, whether we're academics or practitioners, civil society organizations, we deal with so many of the same challenges and the same similarities, that the common things we're dealing with far outweigh, from my perspective, the differences in our political systems, our experiences, or even the state of our technology. I'm reminded of how much time XML and open standards can take. The stories that we heard, the presentations we heard from Canada about Bongani and Komontoso, stories from the U.S. It takes an enormous amount of time. Some countries have been able to do it more quickly, but many have been at it for 10 or 15 years now. It's not exactly comparing apples to oranges, but you can't help but be struck by noting how quickly BlackBerries and iPads were adapted by members of the parliaments, and many parliaments who still don't know what XML is. So there's a disconnect in the adoption rate that is inherent in, I think, in the nature of the infrastructure systems versus those that members can see in front of them. Nevertheless, I was encouraged by some of the examples that I heard here that did, in fact, take somewhat less time to implement and that were clearly quite effective. What Claudio reported for the European Parliament's amendment system seems to me a very effective system that has been implemented with great speed, and if I understand correctly, they're even anticipating its extension into some of the political groups as well. That's a rather unheard of event. If you understand how the political groups work in the European Parliament, you're actually putting the XML tool in the hands of the ultimate end user, which can only lead to, I'm sure, chaos. But it is obviously working and will work well, I'm sure. An example to be followed more closely. The complexity of XML continues to amaze me, but that it nevertheless supports complex and sophisticated applications. We heard about many of those from the Italian Senate and the Camera dei Deputati. And yet Tim shared with us his experience in Papua New Guinea, where he had designed, if I understand his comment correctly, a system based on XML, which was there so that it would be unbreakable, so that users who had relatively little experience in parliamentary processes could do their job with a very sophisticated tool. So the somewhat counterintuitive conclusion that we're using complexity to produce simplicity. Again, struck by how much can be gained by our borrowing from each other, and we need to just do that even more shamelessly. The European Parliament and Brazil borrowing from Komontoso, parliaments with advanced ICT infrastructures borrowing from a project that is intended to support less developed countries in Africa. Some unexpected lessons. I was struck by the emphasis in these discussions on cost savings and efficiencies that can arise from the use of the very complex XML standard. Again, somewhat counterintuitive. Sometimes we adopt these things also to create internal efficiencies. Bob Reeves shared with us the example from the House where they themselves had to go to an XML solution because internal screen scraping was inefficient. They had to go to XML, which is the condition that you often want to be successful with it. Adaptability, XML clearly not critical to the tablet, as Joan has noted, but it can help to leverage its value and its flexibility. And as Sofiane pointed out, XML is an important tool, but it is only one tool in a suite of technologies that includes protocols, databases, and lots of other components, all of which have to be taken into account. And of course, the value of the discussion, open discussions between parliaments and CSO and civil society organizations and academic community that took place within this room were invaluable. Let me close with a story that illustrates for me the value of the work that groups such as this can do in contributing to the development of standards and guidelines for parliaments. Very pragmatic. I'm currently working with a country in the Caribbean as part of a European Union-funded project to assist Caribbean parliaments develop strategic plans for information technology. I'm working with a country that just went from level 4 to level 3 in the World Bank Institute's rankings for income level for countries. In talking with one of the MPs, he told me that 20 years ago, they used to settle their political disagreements in the streets with guns. Now they try to settle them by discussion in the parliament. So for me, a vivid example of the value and the great critical importance of parliamentary democracy. Speaking with the clerk, he told me how vital it was that the parliament be seen as legitimate and relevant and transparent. For the first time, he had seen the Inter-Parliamentary Union's guidelines for websites, which were published in 2009. He held the book up to me and he said, I have 5 years left in my position. I hope to accomplish 80% of these guidelines before I retire. He has his work cut out for him, because I have to tell you that the consultant who created the content management system had fled the country, and they're currently reduced to using Facebook to communicate with the public. A creative solution, I thought, in the face of a less than optimum ICT situation. I'll be back there in 2 weeks discussing their priorities for ICT and how to begin. Obviously, I need a lot of tools for that trip. One of the things that I would like to have is a document with recommendations for implementing XML, especially in developing countries, as an integral and affordable part of its overall ICT program. How should they proceed? What should they use? What should they do first? Who can they call upon? Ideally, this document would be of great use to advanced parliaments as well, as they try to break into new ground, go to the next level. And it needs to be created by an international group of parliamentary experts and advisors who have produced real solutions. I forgot to mention, the ICT department consists of one person. So little time, so much to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And amazingly, we have 5 minutes early, and so I'm opening again the floor for additional comments. I thought that you both have given us really a nice summary of your views about this meeting, but I'm sure that I'd like to hear from other participants.
My question is to Tom and Fabio, and it's where does the study of what you're doing fit in the university? So clearly you're doing it, but this is an interdisciplinary field which typically doesn't work well in most universities. I mean, to do this well, you have to have technical knowledge, legal knowledge, maybe a little political science knowledge. And the other thing is what's going on is sort of highly entrepreneurial, so it's sort of hard if you're a political scientist. They're not in the business of creating things, they're in the business of studying things that are already happening, and since this is new. But it seems unfortunate that there's so little academic firepower addressed on these type of issues. And it's somewhat striking because for other types of ontologies, there's massive, it seems like, political science, or excuse me, academic involvement. Now, I don't know the library sciences areas. Maybe that's the natural fit where it fits in the university. But what explains why it seems to me in the United States we don't have significant, it seems to me, academic firepower on this set of, say, ontologies as opposed to many other ontologies like in biological sciences? You've got a lot of people from medical schools and whatnot really thinking this through. They have an ontology summit with hundreds of people that's gone on, all sorts of ontologies, and this one, you know, doesn't show up. You think, oh, what could be more important than how our democracy works compared to many of these other ontologies? But it doesn't seem to work that way.
Well, I have a number of ideas on that subject, none of them really sort of dispositive, right? For one thing, law schools in the United States don't really study the apparatus that surrounds law as much as they study law. So if you want to look for people who are doing work on what the legal profession does per se, you look to political science departments and that sort of thing. That's equally true of this. The second is the rather Brechtian view that for many years, nobody was particularly interested in studying legal information as information science because they thought of it as the information problems of the rich. That is something that I think has been gradually changing over the last few years, and indeed within the last 5 or 6 years, we're seeing much more work coming out of American legal informatics programs that has to do directly with the study of legal information. If you'd looked around, 8 years ago, you'd have seen far more activity on the part of people writing PhD theses, that sort of thing, having to do with medical information. Just look at the papers that are out there and published, and you'll see that kind of imbalance. Frankly, I think that the transparency initiatives that have come out of government within the last few years have been an enormous attractor in that respect for students. And right now, it's sort of in the stage of something that's looking for a home. You know, again, I think you're right that we've not been as quick to step up to this as elsewhere. I have another more abstract theory about this, which is that actually the study of law as science or anything related to the notion that law might be science takes place more naturally under a civil law system than it does under a common law system. And for that reason, we've seen far more AI in law activity in Europe than we have here. For example, and ontology studies are really in some ways as much derivative of that as they have been a study of text processing. So there's a lot of reasons, as I say, none of them determinative, and the situation is gradually changing.
How is this activity working academically? Not particularly well. Computer science department tends to look at better defined problems and stronger solutions that conclude, that close the topic and move up to another subject and so on. And these things where the continuous interaction with real life problems and with people that basically fight against your ideas and solutions on seems to draw for a lot of time. But on the other hand, I think this is fascinating and challenging, and also justifies my interest in the ontological aspects of it. I think that the legal systems for excellence is the situation where the knowledge representation does not have to describe reality, but rather the perception of reality by humans. Biology, ontologies, medical ontologies, physical ontologies, they deal with facts and relations between things. In the legal system, we also always have the intermediation of the interpretation of humans, and the distinction between what the law is and how the law is understood and applied by the people who apply the law, to me, is still an interesting problem, and is one of those things that make the ontological treatment of knowledge of legal systems harder than other situations.
Well, thank you very much. Time to conclude the session. Let me thank Fabio Vitali, Tom Bruce, and Jeff Griffith for their contribution. And let's move on to the next session by inviting Andy Richardson and the panelists to come to this panel. But we have one intervention.
Yeah, one comment. Someone yesterday had asked about the House recording studio and the facilities the House uses to broadcast committee proceedings. If anyone is interested in a tour of those facilities, the recording studio director is going to be here at 3 o'clock and can take a group through the facilities. So he's going to come to this room at 3.
Thank you very much. So we have Andy Richardson, who will moderate the Session 7, Areas and Modalities of Possible Inter-Parliamentary Cooperation for Greater Transparency.
Okay, let's try and close the circle by talking about some of the forms of interparliamentary cooperation and perhaps considering how they might relate to the kind of subjects that we're talking about here, both increasing transparency and particularly by the use of open document standards. Jeff Griffith just gave a very, very vivid illustration of the fact that of the 190 parliaments of the world, they're really at very different levels of their use of ICT. Global Centre for ICT in Parliament does a very good job of tracking the level of use of ICT in Parliament through the World e-Parliament report. The next report should be coming out in 2012. Amongst other things, it helps to identify parliaments that are at similar levels and helps to establish linkages between them so that they can work together and move forward together. I think here in this room we have the parliaments that are at the very top levels, most advanced use of ICT. There are many others in that would greatly envy their situation. We're going to hear from where are we? Yeah, we're going to hear from a few people who are wearing different hats, both working in their own parliament, but also people who mobilize other forms of interparliamentary cooperation, whether it's on a regional or a thematic basis. So we're going to start, we're going to follow the order here. We're going to start with Rogério Teixeira from Brazil. Thanks.
Thank you. Good morning again. As a member of the Executive Committee, I'm honored to speak on behalf of the Exchange Network of Parliaments on Latin America and the Caribbean, REPALC. This network was created in April 2011 by 16 houses of 14 countries as an institutional mechanism for sharing knowledge, experience, and practice among parliamentary administrations on Latin America and Caribbean, to better meet their representative, legislative, and oversight responsibilities. In order to fulfill this commitment, REPALC relies on a technological platform and website which enable its members not only to exchange news and information, compile documentation, collaborate on comparative studies and publications, but also to serve as an electronic conference room for the Assembly's General Secretary, correspondents, and members of its specific areas of interest. In this context, REPALC offers two different websites: a members-only web portal, which grants to access to all information content, and a public website that is restricted only to news, information on its organizational chart, and a page of related links. Therefore, and bearing in mind all the issues that have been discussed so far in this international meeting, a first question that naturally comes forth from this two-sided website is whether REPALC is in itself transparent enough. This is a very proper question to raise, taking into consideration that the Exchange Network of Parliaments of Latin America and the Caribbean is still a very young organization, which can discuss its role and its future without fear of changing a pre-established and tested dynamics. It is true that REPALC was conceived primarily as a means to increase technical cooperation and the exchange of knowledge and information among parliaments of Latin America and the Caribbean. It is also true that granting full access to information only to its members was conceived as an effective way to foster new memberships. However, although REPALC's main target audience shall always be parliaments and their staffs, that doesn't necessarily mean that its policy towards the general public should remain so restricted. I personally believe that virtually all information content content within the network can be shared freely with society. The possible exception being collaborative studies and joint reports that could be kept classified for a specific period of time, depending on the subject and on how consolidated RIPALC is among their region's parliaments. On the other hand, RIPALC could be a great tool, as it is the Inter-Parliamentarians Union website to collect, organize, and grant full access to information and documents which are already made public by each parliament of the region using open document standards. In sum, RIPALC's website could act as a great hub for all those citizens of the region who are interested in the work of legislative houses. Thus, I intend to propose to the Executive Committee that a discussion on a more open and transparent network should be brought about within the Conference of Correspondents along this year, and depending on its outcome, RIPALC's action program might include concrete changes of policy in that matter. A second relevant issue in inter-parliamentary cooperation, directly related to the theme of this session, concerns one of the RIPALC's specific purpose, which is to promote the effective use of and development of modern tools to exchange information and documentation and assist on technology development and implementation to serve parliamentary functions. In the matter of interparliamentary cooperation, there are 3 steps RIPALC can take to its members achieve greater transparency. The first is to help publicize the results and contents of this international meeting among Latin American and Caribbean parliaments and to society as a whole, either by making the presentations and reports directly available in its platform or by supplying links to the event's website. The second step would be to conduct a comprehensive survey on where Latin American and Caribbean parliaments presently stand on legal, regulatory, and technical aspects to publicity on parliamentary, legislative, and administrative activities, access to documents, transparency, and citizen participation. The results of the survey will help pinpoint areas of common interest and possible technical cooperation projects in these areas. Finally, RIPALC can soon create a specific ICT community to deal with open document standards and other technological issues concerning transparency and citizen participation, in which the United Nations Global Center for ICT in Parliament, as well as other organizations and parliamentary networks, should be most welcome to participate as active observers. In few words, we can say that it's necessary to RIPALC to be strongly established first. This step is very important to achieve common and standard and open source development model, as Mr. Flavio Zeni spoke at this morning. The second phase, but I think not so far, should be the transparency of RIPALC's data to all citizens. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is perhaps the youngest of the networks that's represented here, and it's very exciting that this is taking place in Latin America, where there are a number of
April 2011.
April 2011, yeah, that's right. Taking part in a region where there are a number of parliaments that are also leaders in this field and can perhaps help raise the game across the continent. A slightly longer established network is the IFLA section on library and research services, which is currently chaired by John Pullinger from the UK.
Thank you very much, Andy. During the last 3 days, the word library has come up on several occasions. I think sometimes in a sense of exasperation with some people, if only the library would do this, and in other senses, a feeling that the library, because of its role on documentation and access to information, has a pivotal role in making some of these things we've talked about happen. And the group that I have the honour to chair is part of a much wider grouping of libraries and information professionals around the world. And what I'll do briefly in my presentation today is say a little bit about that grouping, because I think it is very relevant to our discussions, including the discussion we just had about the link into the academic world, where I think there are potential for a great deal richer collaboration sometimes than we have had before. But also to say something more generally about regional networks, and Rogerio has just talked about RIPALC, and I think the power of regional networks is especially important in this environment, not least because of language. So in Southern America, I mean, the fact you've got Spanish as a language of very many countries. I mean, it's more difficult if you're Portuguese speaking or English speaking, but it's an opportunity for a large number of people who speak the same language to come together, and that makes communication easier. So regional networks are very important to IFLA, and I think very important to our discussions. I'll say a brief word about some current initiatives we're involved in that are relevant to this, and give some examples. So what is IFLA? I mean, IFLA is an international body about libraries and information services, so a serious overlap, I think, with the discussions of this group here, because the whole purpose is sharing information and knowledge. IFLA as a body is independent, international, non-government, not-for-profit. It's a small outfit based in the Netherlands with 8 or 9 staff, but it commands a network of hundreds of thousands of librarians and information professionals across the world. And a lot of its activities are really closely linked to what we've talked about here. Freedom of access to information, a big agenda around human rights and the individual's ability to empower themselves through knowledge is a key driver of IFLA. But standards in the library world and also spilling into our world is a big part of the work, and something we haven't talked too much about here, but the whole digital agenda more generally, creating knowledge, putting knowledge into digital formats so that we can use it, but also so we can preserve it much more reliably for future generations. So the parliamentary section, we have 110 members from 50 countries. We are very much engaged in these broader IFLA debates. I mean, particularly the human rights debate has a very close affinity with the whole idea of democracy and what we are doing within Parliament. We're closely linked to the IPU. We had a very powerful, I thought, conference in 2008 jointly with the IPU and the Association of Secretaries Generals of Parliaments and the IFLA section, looking at the idea about how collectively we make democracy a more well-informed enterprise. And through that endeavour and others, we have had for many years now a very deep connection with the Global Centre and the work of the whole team. And I'll come on to the idea of training in a minute, but I think that's something we haven't talked about very much, but I think is an opportunity for us to really embed some of the ideas that we've talked about in theoretical terms over the last 3 days. So I'll come to regional networks now. Not all of these networks are specifically about libraries, but they are specifically about parliaments. And they exist across most regions of the world now. Ravi's going to say something a little bit about APKN in a minute, so I won't say anything about that. But some of them cover multiple countries, some of them within countries. I mean, Canada, for example, they're the provinces, and we've heard it in the United States environment too. Parliaments are not unique even in their own countries. There are bodies who have got the same kind of information flows that we deal with, and the more we can network with them, the better. The two that I'm most familiar with are the ones at the bottom. ECPRD has come up in debate here. I think in many ways it is the richest of the inter-parliamentary regional networks. It's certainly been going a long time. But one of the reasons it is very rich, and a reason that makes it work is something Rogerio mentioned just now, the idea of a network of correspondence. So someone whose job it is in each country to sustain and maintain that network, I think is an essential feature of making this happen. And I think one of the questions that Joan Miller asked this morning, so why isn't this happening? It's all obvious. We know we want this to happen. XML is a no-brainer. We don't need to discuss it anymore. Part of the problem is it's not actually anyone's job to pick this up. Within these regional networks, making it someone's job to keep the communications going, keep the website of RIPALC or the other ones going, keep the connections between each of the member institutions going is essential. But they don't have to be big or complex networks, and we have one within the British Isles. The United Kingdom Parliament in Westminster, which is where I come from, is only one parliament within our islands. We have parliaments in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland and some smaller islands of Britain, the Channel Islands and the Isle of Man. We have a number of parliamentary assemblies. We can learn from each other. Often the biggest can learn from the smallest because the smallest can do things very quickly. But certainly the smallest can learn from the biggest because they can steal ideas very, very straightforwardly. So regional networks I commend to you. But just in case Rogerio thought I'd forgotten him, I thought I would give a plug for RIPALC, and we didn't do any conferring on that. But within the library world, RIPALC has been of great benefit to us. And specifically, I mentioned a meeting in Chile last year with the Global Centre looking at leveraging ICT within the parliamentary library context. These forums give an opportunity not just for Secretaries General, not just for IT professionals, but for libraries and a whole range of other people who could reasonably communicate with each other. And RIPALC isn't the most recent of all. There is a new one that Gerardo and I were involved in, and Jeff is smiling, were involved in creating just last month. On the 20th of January, we created, or were part of creating a network of Arab parliamentary libraries. The Secretary General of the Arab IPU was present, but the really important people who were present were 10 countries listed there. The great thing about those countries, more or less, they all spoke Arabic. So they were able to think about and make progress very, very fast. And in a handful of days, they created an institution that had some very practical activities. And the commonality of language help them to do that. And I think that example, and you look at those countries, you look at what many of them have been through in recent years, it was really inspiring to see, particularly for those of us in old democracies that struggle and complain about the problems that we've got. It certainly makes you think, when we heard the testimony from my counterpart in Tunisia, for example, of what's happened just in 1 year in that country. It was very sobering. And they are moving fast, some of these countries, and we would do well to learn from the experience that they're having. So, current initiatives within the IFLA section. I mentioned training, and I would emphasise it. We've benefited hugely within the library community from the support of the Global Centre and Gerardo in particular, his drive to get to very practical steps of bringing people, particularly from smaller democracies, together to sit them in front of a screen, to learn from their colleagues, to say, so what is this XML? How could I apply it to my documents? And physically getting people into a training room, talking to each other, I think is something I would certainly commend to this group from our experience, because that's where the rubber does hit the road. People go home with something practical on a memory stick, on a website that they can then use the day they get back. So we don't forget the great things we've done here. We actually do them and apply them in our work. So training, I think, is a very important lesson, modality in the word of this session that we can use. Conferences do work. So after this conference, the next one that I'll be involved in, we have a session on usability and accessibility with the IFLA IT section. So again, this is people who are involved in IT, in university libraries, in public libraries, in special libraries, in law libraries, getting the cross-fertilisation from those different people who've got the same kind of mind process that we have, but are not necessarily working in the same type of institution. And the final one on there is a handbook. We are releasing this year an ICT handbook for parliamentary libraries, which has been an initiative led by a man called Edmund Balnavis in Australia, but a global look at the state of play, what we can learn from each other in the ICT world that is relevant to making libraries work better. And of course, top of the list, standards. What are the standards that are working? How can we apply them in our world? But also software, what can we steal? Some very specific case studies, making it practical. And finally, an example from the UK about making it practical, and it came up, I can put this in, and it came up from the US presentation, this idea of hackathons. And I put this idea in before the session, before I came here, and I think the relevance of it is even stronger now, because we learn most strongly by doing things. And our hackathon was part of our transparency programme and the creation of Data.Parliament UK, which is still very much in its infancy. But we invited 50 programmers, developers to come in, gave them all pizza on the weekend of the 5th of November 2011 with an organisation called Rewired State. And if you Google Rewired State, you'll get to all the information. But they just took our publicly available data and played with it. And we got 22 programmes out of a weekend's work that were things that were immediately applicable to MPs, helping them in their work, deal with their legislative activities, but also to the public, explaining what we do to them. So if only we can liberate the data, present it in a way that is in a standard that people can understand and reuse and link up with other stuff, we can stand back. And there are many people in this room who've told us their stories today. But if we invite them in to help us with our work, we can help them with their work, and a whole range of things will be liberated. So I was asked to talk about areas and modalities for possible interparliamentary communication, and it's all about talking to each other, getting people sitting down together, doing realistic, practical things. And a lot of this stuff will happen by itself. And we've got to get out of these conference rooms and sit down at PCs and do some code. Thank you very much. Oh, I'll put some more on there.
Thank you, John. You finished?
Yeah, I've finished.
Okay.
Even if my slides didn't quite.
They didn't quite happen. Covering the whole range between a kind of a global organisation building down into regional groupings, establishing linkages, and then doing very practical things nationally as well. It's great. We're going to go to Scott Hubley, who's the Director of Governance Programs at the National Democratic Institute here in Washington. Scott.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Andy. It's a pleasure to be here. I apologize for not having been able to be here for the course of the 3 days. Some of you may have met Andrew Mandelbaum, my colleague, who's been here over the course of the week, and it sounds like it's been a very interesting discussion. NDI is a little bit at the margins of this community, and so I hope I'm able to offer a few things that might be of interest. But I think what I'm going to talk a little bit about is more kind of at least one example of interparliamentary cooperation in this general area, but also talk about cooperation within the broader parliamentary community, because there are other actors that are engaged in this, and also within the broader transparency community, some of which I think have been touched on, but just so that they're, I guess, on your radar to the extent that they're useful. So our role, we're a US-based nonprofit working currently in about 60 countries on a range of issues related to democratic development. Some of that involves parliamentary strengthening. Often when we work with parliaments, it's helping respond to requests on things like constituency relations or public outreach. It's rare that we get involved in kind of the nuts and bolts of technology hardware, although our role often is to help facilitate connections with the people that are experts in this field. And we I think have partnered with a lot of the organizations represented in this conference in kind of facilitating connections, particularly in parliaments that are at the very beginning stage of this curve and are facing very kind of challenging ICT contexts or very limited resources. So that's kind of the perspective that we are coming at this from. Just briefly, a few initiatives that haven't, if they haven't popped up on your radar, might or may not be worth knowing about. The first is a web portal on parliamentary development. The partners behind it are listed on the bottom of the screen. There's kind of a core group of managing partners that include UNDP, the World Bank, the European Commission, International IDEA in Stockholm, and NDI. But there are a range of additional partners. But the idea was to have a portal to make available the wealth of materials that have been developed in and around parliamentary strengthening. It's operational now in English, French, increasingly Russian. There are plans to also have it available in Arabic. But it's there for the use by the broader community. There is a public portion of this with a number of resources. There's also a member, much more, I guess, extensive private part of this. You need to get a member sign-on. It's easily done. Just make the request. But in addition to the public face of this, there are opportunities for discussion groups. There are active discussions, for example, on things like parliaments and crisis environments. There's some regional discussions that are taking place. There's some donor coordination discussions that are taking place. There's a range of ways to structure those discussion groups, from being completely open to all of the members to being by invitation only or more closed. But it's available as a resource. So I would encourage you, if there are materials your various parliaments are producing that would be of interest to the broader parliamentary community, to donors that are supporting parliamentary development, it's a place that you're welcome to share your materials, upload documents. And it's also available for use for discussion groups, blogs. There is kind of this social media element of it. There's a consultant roster kind of and profiles for people that are active on issues of parliamentary development. So that's one just to mention out there. A second kind of set of initiatives that NDI has been engaged in supporting that's also perhaps worth having on your radar screen. Over the last 5 years or so, there have been a number of efforts by parliamentary associations to come up with standards or benchmarks for democratic parliaments. I think the idea was initially that in the field of democratic elections, there are fairly clear standards about what a democratic election looks like in terms of not using state resources, about use of state media, all of these things that contribute to a competitive democratic election environment. For parliaments, in a lot of the discussion about parliaments or what countries are democracies, it was fairly wide open, and the threshold was really just being democratically elected, but not necessarily much beyond that. So there was an effort to codify kind of norms, minimum rights for opposition, minimum transparency, minimum institutional autonomy, minimum powers of parliaments. Some form of benchmarks have been adopted by the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, the Assemblée Parlementaire de la Francophonie, the Southern African Development Communities Parliamentary Forum, and the Confederation of Parliaments of the Americas. Information on all of those are available at the website on the screen. There's an Agora page that's kind of collected them. Transparency issues are touched on at a very, very high level. It's not its focus, but I reference it as one kind of additional modality as you're thinking about standards or trying to get alignment within among legislatures on some of these issues. There is precedent. The kind of the work that's been done on the IPU and Global Centers guidelines on parliamentary websites is heavily referenced in these various efforts and cited as an element of good practice. But again, if I think they're most helpful in countries that are at the beginning stages of this and are fighting for basic issues of parliamentary independence and fighting for resources, it's helpful to them to say it's an international norm to have this. But anyway, one set of resources. I think Andrew may have mentioned, or Sunlight Foundation, one of our partners, may have mentioned a conference that's being held in April with a group of parliamentary monitoring organizations or civil society organizations that do work on parliaments, scorecarding, work with parliaments collaboratively to make more parliamentary information public. That community is very new. Some of them have used methodologies that are not particularly useful. They're struggling in a number of countries. I think our goal in facilitating exchanges among them is simply to help them mature and to engage more collaboratively with parliaments. I think there's often a very adversarial relationship between civil society and parliaments, particularly in a number of developing countries. And so the hope is to provide an opportunity for exchange of information among this emerging community. There is an interest in kind of sharing their vision of what types of information they would like available. They're consumers of parliamentary information. There is discussion about trying to come up with a wish list on the civil society side for types of parliamentary information, types of requests on open data. And so that's something that may be discussed at this conference. I think also there's interest in sharing information that they've collected through this network of civil society organizations with each other and kind of sharing information on parliamentary transparency. So that's another initiative to, I guess, keep on the radar screen. It's something that we've also collaborated with IPU and the Global Center in terms of sharing information about. And then lastly, just to mention it, again, it's something that many of you may be aware of or engaged in. The Open Government Partnership, currently chaired by Brazil, is an effort on the executive branch side to make government information more transparent, more accessible. It's focused on government engagement and with civil society engagement. Oftentimes parliaments have been a little bit at the margins of that, but I think there are perhaps opportunities for greater discussion between parliamentary efforts to advance transparency and openness with the OGP process as well. And it's another example in terms of a modality or a way that countries have worked together to advance common interests in transparency. So with that, I'll stop.
Thanks, Scott, for that very rich presentation. Thank you. We'll close with news from the African Parliamentary Knowledge Network from Ravi Bolia of South Africa.
Thank you, Andy, and good afternoon. I know it's the graveyard shift for the meeting, so I'll try and be brief. I think for most of you, I think it would be fair for me to do a little bit of introduction and probably some marketing, so I hope you would bear with me for a while. The Africa Parliamentary Knowledge Network, or APKN as it is commonly known, is a fairly young network, and it was the baby of the parliamentary networks until last year when RIPALC came about. So we're kind of second in this line of parliamentary networks. But we have made some significant progress, particularly within the African continent. And we have, in its initial stages, I think the thought behind the creation of the network was to focus on ICT. But after a number of discussions with parliaments and speakers, there was a proposal that perhaps the APKN should be more than just a technology-focused network and should focus on the other areas of Parliament. So at the last Speakers' Conference, we had an amendment to our charter where we've actually included 3 additional areas that we would focus on, particularly around legislation, communication, information and research, and the administration as well. And I think most of you would be aware that African parliaments have their own unique set of challenges. and therefore requires a unique set of solutions. So for the last few years, the Parliament of South Africa has had the honor of hosting the Secretariat. Well, I shouldn't say last few years, it's only a year now that we've taken it on. And the ultimate aim for our Parliament is to build a strong Secretariat, because at the end of the day, the permanent home for APK and Secretariat lies with the Pan-African Parliament, which is the continental body. And our function at this point is to build a strong Secretariat and then hand over in a year or two to the Pan-African Parliament. But having said that, it does operate under the authority of the speakers of all the African parliaments, and they give us the political direction. It also has a body that's called the Council of Secretaries Generals that consists of 5 parliaments selected from each of the regions, as well as representatives from each of the regional parliaments in Africa. It is quite a productive body. We've met on several occasions. Our last meeting was hosted by the East African Legislatures Assembly in Arusha in Tanzania in November of last year. It was an excellent meeting for us because it was probably one of the first times that we sat as a Council of Secretaries Generals as well as African assemblies and came up with a strategic plan for the network. So then that brings us essentially to the topic of discussion and what are the modalities and the areas of cooperation and collaboration for transparency. I think as a network, as African Parliamentary Knowledge Network, admittedly we have a number of challenges. One of them is the skills to develop and implement a lot of these programs, but also the resources. So we depend largely on a number of very benevolent organizations, particularly around UNDESA, who's been one of our strong partners. Fabio has left the room, but he's been one of our staunchest champions. In fact, he was there at the very beginning and gave us a huge amount of support. And of course, we would look to other organizations. The European Parliament has been very supportive. ECPRD has been very supportive to us. And very soon, I'm sure one of our sister networks in Latin America and the Caribbean countries will also provide some assistance. The Akomontoso, as most of you know, is, and I'm very proud to say, although I won't take credit, is an African product. And so it's very strange, though, that the implementation of Akomontoso in Africa is far less than it has been in other countries outside of Africa. And I think there's a number of reasons for that, is particularly where you think of African countries that have more pressing issues to deal with, and largely because of the lack of resources. So our focus has been particularly around assisting parliaments to put in basic infrastructure, to assist them with strategic planning. And one of the areas we've been focusing on in the last year is strategic plans in the SADC region, where our parliament has been very, very influential in trying to assist in developing those strategic plans together with the Global Center. And our hope is that at some point we would move those programs further into Africa, into the other 4 regions. In our strategic planning, the key areas that are generally spoken of is, and this may sound, I think, sometimes a bit simplistic, but these are the unique challenges that we have in Africa, where the simple matter of having a dedicated computer to perform work in some parliaments is a challenge. Having networks in place is a challenge. So before we can talk Akomontoso and standardizations, we have to assist in putting in the basic infrastructure. So I think in the next year or two, that will be our focus, is trying to assist those parliaments. But having said that, there are a number of parliaments that have actually improved significantly in the last few years, that have made huge strides in the development. And some of these parliaments have started to look at Akomontoso, Bongeni, as the application, and have very well developed infrastructure and strategic plans, very strong leadership. And so we try and assist and leverage the skills that some of those parliaments have. As for the issues of transparency, well, I think notoriously parliaments in Africa have had particular challenges with public participation and oversight and accountability. And I'm not going to get into the details of all of that, but I think you're well aware of it. But I think as a country, as a continent, and as a network, we are assisting many of those parliaments to put the tools and the mechanisms in place. I don't think it's a lack of willingness to get the public involved in the legislative and oversight processes. I think it's just the mechanisms that are lacking. So as far as that transparency goes, we have a number of programs as part of our strategic plan in the next few years to assist those parliaments. So I suspect that in the next 2 years, my job as the secretary to the Africa Parliamentary Network would be to implement that plan. So don't be surprised if I come knocking on your door and ask for assistance. So I'm making my plug now. So you won't be surprised if I send you a mail and I say, because just listening to the discussions over the last few days, I realized that many of you have, I think, a number of skills. You have a lot of intellectual property. You have a lot of knowledge in these areas. It would be irresponsible of us if we did not leverage it as a community of parliaments globally to assist parliaments that need the assistance. So again, don't be surprised and remember this face and the name. You'll probably be getting an email from me very soon. But again, let me thank, while we're in a global forum, I think it's important to thank those that have been very supportive. Gerardo and his team have been very, very supportive of the network, and I think we want to say thank you to them. Mr. John Mary Kahuza, who's also from Mundesa, who's also been very supportive in assisting us. Flavio ran out of the room. Is he back? Where is he? He's up and down all over the place. And the people from ECPRD, I think Dick Toonstra has been assisting us from the European Parliament. I hope I haven't left anybody out. It's always an issue if you do, but I thought I would take this opportunity of thanking them for their assistance. And of course, it's not the end. It's just the beginning. We'll be knocking on your doors very again shortly. So thank you. And that's all from me. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ravi, for sharing this information with us. I take the opportunity to recognize another parliamentary network, which is a very, very long established and important one, which is the Association of Secretaries General of Parliament, presided by Mark Bosk of Canada, who's spoken to us during this conference. The Secretaries General, as the heads of parliamentary administration, playing a really vital role in bringing the institutional support, both to transparency initiatives, but also to supporting the networking initiatives, whether in Africa and Latin America, whether amongst the libraries of the networks of parliamentary libraries, which often operate in very, very challenging contexts and really rely on this institutional support from their leadership. As Joan Miller referred to rightly, all of us, all of the people in parliaments have their day jobs, and it's very easy to get caught up in that, and it's important to have that institutional backing for networking among your peers, which is going to add value to the way that you're doing your jobs in Parliament. We have a couple of minutes. I'll take some questions and comments, if you have any for our presenters, about any of the different initiatives and activities that we've heard. Claudio, please.
Yes, I take the opportunity to remind that in May, the European Parliament will arrange a workshop. Specifically will be the IT General Directorate together with the Office for the Promotion of Parliamentary Democracy. Probably the workshop will be focused on tools for management of content, of legislative content based on XML. We will probably focus on some use case, will be very practical. Yeah, and
I think it could also be seen as a natural continuation of this event.
Thank you. Yeah, Gerardo from the Global Center.
Well, I have to intervene at this point because, no, in reality, what the Global Center, I mean, I thank you for the kind words, but in reality, the Global Center really tries hard to keep parliaments in the driving seat. Maybe not all of you knows, but the Global Center is driven by a board of a senior, high-level board of speakers of parliament, and the president of the ASGP also sits in the board. Not only that, Ravi, you mentioned the activities in the strategic area, in the area of ICT strategic planning, and this is only one example for us. We were able to be provided with funds by the European Union, in this case, for supporting parliaments in the area of ICT strategic planning. But what we tried to do really was to be a vehicle for transmitting the expertise of other parliaments into parliaments in the SADC region, in the Caribbean region as well. So rather than thanking me, I think we should thank all the parliaments who have supported this initiative by providing the expertise and the staff, releasing the staff for these missions. And you know, I can probably leave out many, but we had the UK Parliament, the Chile, Brazil, South Africa, of course, but and many, Italy and many others. So really, when Secretaries General and the administration provide us with the time and of their staff, and yes, we do put the funding for the travel of the staff, but it's really a little contribution in my view, because the contribution is the knowledge and the exchange among peers. There is a great opportunity for interparliamentary cooperation, in my opinion. So. Yes, thank you for your kind words, but I need to thank all the parliaments that have done so for us. Thank you.
Thank you. Any others? I have a question for Scott. A parliamentary transparency pledge. Could you say just a little more about what that? Who would be pledging what to who?
I think that's all to be determined. I think our goal is to provide a platform for discussion. But I think in a survey that we did, which the cover was on one of the slides, but it's available on our website as well, jointly with the World Bank Institute, we did a survey of this emerging set of actors, these parliamentary monitoring organizations or civil society groups that are doing things like parliamentary scorecarding. Looked at kind of what the challenges are, if they're being, the extent to which they're being effective. I think there's a concern a little bit that many of these organizations approach their watchdog role with a very kind of scandal-based orientation, or focused on gathering headlines rather than kind of stimulating parliamentary development or reform. So the idea really is to kind of help them mature, help them work more collaboratively, play their legitimate watchdog role, but do so in a way that is engages in constructive dialogue with parliaments. I think one of the challenges that they most often express is lack of access to the information. The range of challenges is enormous. In some environments where these organizations are working, it's simply votes aren't recorded. Everything is by voice vote, or by acclamation in some cases. It's hard to get good data on who's taking what positions on legislation. In other cases, the challenges are much more kind of along the lines of open data and kind of getting, reducing the costs of scraping websites and the like. But I think the idea was that they collectively have shared interest in trying to advance transparency of parliamentary information, open data, but also reinforcing notions of an enabling environment that allows civil society to play this watchdog role. So there was discussion about how to kind of express that, whether there is a pledge, whether there is a kind of statement of principles, that there I think is a lot out there already. And the idea as it's been expressed or discussed with people that have been involved in organizing this has been more along the lines of codifying good practice and things that's already out there. But I think there is interest in advancing this discussion and doing it with civil society. I mean, we work a lot with parliamentarians. There's, I think, a lot of examples of bad practice where civil society has gone about this in a way that's not particularly helpful, but they are out there. They are taking, there's investments in these organizations. They are kind of, there is a lot of talent there in producing the types of applets and hackathon-type products. There's some very, very bright young IT programmers within this community. They've not necessarily been engaged always in the most productive way, and our fear a little bit has been that some of this civil society pressure kind of does more to build cynicism in democratic institutions than it does actually support parliamentary strengthening and reform. So I think that's the challenge that we're trying to help facilitate a discussion around. We'll see what comes out of this. It's kind of owned by the PMOs, and whether or not there is something that emerges from this or not, very much yet to be determined. But I think this phenomena of PMOs is relatively new. There is a fair amount of coordination within Latin America on a regional level that's emerging through this Latin American Network on Legislative Transparency, but globally it's just beginning. And so we'll see where it leads, but I think it's something that should not necessarily be ignored, and it's helpful to try and engage constructively.
Yeah, very quickly from a question from Ann Washington.
I just really had a comment. I'm just sitting here really appreciative of the thoughtfulness and kindness that I hear between everyone and the potential collaborations, and back up what Sylvia said, that there are the people who have to respond quickly and meet the needs of the legislature, and there are those outside who will be monitoring it and looking at it overall, and then the role of academics where we can sit back and perhaps put together some of these best practices and thoughts that we've heard today that obviously people who are in the middle of it all won't have time to do. But I think we really have the right mix here as a community to build the things we need to build to move forward.
Great, thanks. I think many would echo those sentiments. Let's then close this session. We're going to move into the final one for the closing remarks, where I think we'll have also a few words from the Global Centre about possible ways forward, based on some of the suggestions that we've heard during the week. So if you could join me in thanking presenters for their discussions. Thank you.
me just, is John Mary's coming? Before we have our closing remarks, we'd like to take a few minutes and ask Gerardo Cassini to give us kind of an overview and a summary of what we've been through the last couple days. So if we could all just take a couple minutes for that summary, and then we'd like to close with some final remarks. Gerardo?
Thank you very much, Madam Clerk. Meeting summary. Delegates from 16 parliamentary chambers, along with representatives of civil society organizations and the academic community, participated in the international meeting Achieving Greater Transparency in Legislatures through the use of open document standards, co-organized by the US House of Representatives, the United Nations, and the Inter-Parliamentary Union through the Global Center for ICT in Parliament on 27, 28, and 29 February 2012. During the meeting discussion, several important themes emerged. Open document standards are a vital technology for supporting the values of parliamentary democracy as defined by the Inter-Parliamentary Union in 2006, with particular emphasis on transparency and efficiency. Only a limited number of parliaments have implemented or are planning to the use of open standards in parliamentary records in the near future, making this topic an emerging issue for interparliamentary cooperation in the years to come. Despite differences in their approach to open document standards, legislatures share the same challenges and needs. There is significant value in continuing the dialogue among parliaments about open document standards, both at the regional and global level, also taking into consideration the perspectives of civil society organizations and the academic community. Open document standards can be leveraged to quickly and flexibly embrace new communication channels for members and the public, such as mobile devices and video. The expectations of rapid technological developments in these areas will require special attention by parliaments in the future. A higher level of cooperation is needed among parliaments so that knowledge, expertise, tools, and practices on open document standards can be effectively shared and placed at the disposal of the parliamentary community. There is a need to identify a series of internationally agreed criteria and benchmarks for assessing the contribution of the use of open document standards to the values of a democratic parliament: representation, transparency, accessibility, accountability, and effectiveness. These benchmarks should guide parliaments in their implementation of open document standards, as well as help them determine the degree of their success in advancing both their efficiency objectives and overall transparency goals. To this end, consensus emerged among the delegates for the establishment of an interparliamentary working group on open document standards under the framework of the UN and IPU's Global Center for ICT in Parliament. This group, open to legislatures using open document standards, will provide a forum for advancing the state of open document standards in parliaments by identifying problems, analyzing potential solutions, and recommending guidelines and standards. It will serve as a hub for providing visibility to the various initiatives taking place in this arena. The working modalities of the group and its interaction with interested stakeholders, including global and regional parliamentary networks, will be defined by the participating parliaments at their first meeting. Delegates welcome the opportunity of a fruitful exchange of experiences and practices offered by the international meeting, Achieving Greater Transparency in Legislatures through the use of open document standards, and express their appreciation to the US House of Representatives, the United Nations, and the Inter-Parliamentary Union for having taken the initiative of organizing this important consultation. Thank you.
Let me start off by first thanking Gerardo Cassini, Jeff Griffith, and Bob Reeves from my staff for all the hard work behind the scenes to make this meeting possible. And I want to also again thank all of you for your participation in this international meeting. We are so pleased that you were able to join us, and we are also pleased that we were able to co-organize this event with the UN and the IPU. We have had, as was stated by Gerardo, representation from 16 parliamentary chambers, along with members of civil service organizations and the academic community, all with a focus on transparency. It is clear that despite our differences and the differences between our parliaments, we share many of the very same challenges. I believe there is much to be gained by continuing this dialogue, and we are anxious to participate in any future working groups on this topic. Additionally, we should explore ways to engage civil societies, universities, and other experts in this dialogue. Many of you have traveled a long distance to participate in these meetings. We truly appreciate the time you have taken to share your best practices and to engage in this important topic. Let's build on the foundation that we have laid and continue to work together toward progress and greater transparency in legislatures. Thank you.
Let me start with a confession. At the beginning of the conference, I almost said, well, New York is not very far. Why don't I go now that I have opened the conference? Because I was slightly intimidated by the language of technology. But now I'm very glad that I stayed. Because I wondered what I was doing among all the ICT experts who speak a language I don't understand. But by staying, not only did I have the opportunity to have a clearer insight of the legislative processes of the US Congress and House of Representatives and the Senate, but also as I listened to the presentations and discussions, I came to confirm that there is a meeting point between the promotion of parliamentary democracy and the application of information and communications technologies. And I realized that all of you gathered here seemingly extremely scientific and technologically aware. You occupy a very important and critical place at this meeting point. And you may as well, alongside parliamentarians and senators, be the most critical promoters of democratic practices, especially in as much as the application of ICT holds great potential for facilitating and sustaining transparency, participation, and openness for accountability. And that has a lot to do with my work. And talking about my work, I would want to take this opportunity to thank my colleagues, Geraldo and his team, Fabio and his team, They are worlds apart. One is in Nairobi, another one is in Rome, and I'm based in New York, and I am supposed to supervise them. That's globalization in practice. But I would like to thank them for the efforts they put in this work, for joining the House of Representatives, the Inter-Parliamentary Union, the 16 parliaments gathered here to do this work, which I believe for sure will sustain the future of, I should say, fighting for democracy. I should conclude by saying that in emphasizing democracy, it's not accidental. I love democracy. But also, you know, our Secretary General has just started his second term, and he has put the promotion of democracy all over the world on his program for the entire team. And those of us who work with him, we are empowered to always talk for democracy. And I thank you very much for being part of this office, of this effort. Thank you very much.
So as the last person standing between you and lunch, I'll be brief. In echoing our previous speakers, I would like also to commend Gerardo and his team and those who helped him put this conference together. I think the importance of these exchanges is something that we all talk about, but when it's actually happening, it's nice to see, and we all benefit from it. The other message that I think comes across through this meeting is that the importance in each of our home parliaments, those of us who work in parliaments, the importance of having that close partnership and having the IT function at the management table. I think it's evident that it is happening here in Washington, and it happens in other places, but not everywhere. And I think that's a key message as well of this conference, is that the importance of working together within institutions as well. And I will want to conclude with a word of thanks, again, to our hosts, Madam Clerk, Bob, and all of those here in Washington who helped host this event. They've done a wonderful job. They've been very generous with their time, and they surprised us with arranging for visits from parliamentarians, the Speaker, and others. So that is no mean feat, and I want to say how much we appreciated that effort as well. So thank you, and enjoy your travels back home.
Gerardo, anything else? This concludes our session. And as has been said, safe travels home. We're here for those of you that are still staying around a little bit. My office is available. Please let us know if there's anything that you need while you're still here. Thank you.
I've heard about you from the parliamentarians, so it was great to have the opportunity.
Very good to meet you, and again, thank you so much for everything you've done. It's wonderful.
Are you both leading?